to participate in what we believe is a very important area of discussion and focus. We have pulled together some very important minds throughout the African world. I must say, however, that just because we've pulled together some important minds here, that we know out there among all of you are very important minds. And so that this is the gathering of people who are serious about doing business relative to African world people generally and African world women specifically. I am Jacqueline Wade, and I am the moderator of this session. And I'd like to just kind of give you an overview of how we're going to do business this afternoon. First of all, I have to say that at the moment I am extremely tired, and it reminds me of a reality in this world that over 3/4 of the world's work is done by women, particularly women of African descent. I feel at this moment that I have taken on all of that 3/4 worth of work today. But nevertheless, the beauty of African women, wherever they are, is that they manage to go on despite whatever hardships or hardness or trials or tribulations, because they know, we know, that as the mothers of the world, whether mothers in the figuratively or literally, that there's a lot of work that has to be done, and we will do it despite what we personally feel. So that it is in that spirit that today we come together to frame some very important and salient issues relative to our past and current condition and what we must be about to assure that our future is not identical to our past and our current position relative to the many issues that face us. I would like to now introduce our panelists who will, from their own individual perspectives, comment on some of the salient issues and themes, after which we will then open up the discussion for a real dialogue. And what we do want to do today, what we don't want to do today, I'll put it that way, is only bemoan the problems. We can, yes, reflect on the problems so that it gives us some manner of focus in terms of what some of the key areas of concern are or ought to be. But more importantly, we want to take this opportunity to use our collective minds and experiences to develop action agendas for our use, both collectively and individually, in moving into the 21st century. This is the last decade of the 20th century, and we don't have a lot of time to prepare for our movement into the new millennium, so that all of us, male and female, and children, have grave individual and collective responsibility for moving our lives more positively and more constructively into the future. With that, I would like to first, I will go down and just introduce everyone, and then our first panelist will speak. First, we have my very good sister friend here, Dr. LaFrancis Rogers Rose, who we go back many, many, many years and our paths keep crossing, and it's wonderful to reunion with her here in the great country of a relatively new sister friend of mine, Dr. Essie, Dr. Essie Sutherland Addy, who is a Ghanaian woman, a very important Ghanaian woman, formerly the Deputy Commissioner of Education. Next we have Ms. Sharon Bailey, who I just recently met, who comes from the school district of, Sharon, tell me again, Denver, Colorado, and doing some very wonderful work on behalf of Africana children, particularly in Colorado, and all children generally. Next, we have Dr. Florence Dolphin, who is the Dean of the College of Arts at the University of Ghana, Legon. And last but not least, we have Dr. Julianne Malvo, who is at San Francisco State University, not anymore, what, you never were? Several jobs. Okay, several jobs, okay. But without further ado, I will ask LaFrancis to start us off with her perspective of our reality.
Thank you very much, and Hotep, brothers and sisters. It's very good to be on the continent to contemplate and to think about what it is that we have to do as women of African ancestry to move ourselves into the 21st century. I would suggest that we are on no one's agenda for the 21st century, and unless we put ourselves on the agenda, you will find that we will be constantly overlooked and missed. I am the president and founder of the International Black Women's Congress, and 21 of us have been traveling for nearly 21 days now. And for some of those women who are in the group, this is their very first time of coming back home to the motherland, and it's been just a tremendous experience, and going down to the Cape Coast and going into those dungeons and feeling the vibrations and the flow of our ancestors have been absolutely awesome. And so the comments that I have to make is sort of framed within having been traveling for those many days and feeling those kinds of energies, and also having for the last 25 years been trying to look at and address issues that impact the lives of women of African descent. And what we try to do in the International Black Women's Congress is to make sure that when we talk, that we are aware of the fact that we have been scattered more than any other people in the world because of our, one, I guess, original migration, and then two, because of our oppressors who forcefully took us away from this land some 400 years ago. And so it is very difficult to travel any place in the world and not find somebody of African descent. And so the comments that I have to make are in that vein. In the Husia, which are selections of the ancient sacred writings of ancient Egypt, Dr. Maulana Karenga in his retranslation talks about the day of vindication. And it says that in the day of vindication of judgment, will they be able to say that your soul lifts itself up before my heart and be found to be righteous on earth? And will you be given your heart, which comes from your mother? Interesting that when one is finally at the day of vindication, when all things will be made clear and open, is the question that is being raised to you is that before you pass over to this next life, will you be given the heart which comes from your mother? And it says that in the final day of vindication, will they say, and I quote, may you ascend to see Hathor, love and beauty exalted. You are the spirit whom Nut the mother of heaven bore, and Nephtha, your sister spirit, suckled, and they have put you together. It is in that spirit to suggest that in an ancient Kemetic sense is that one cannot do anything without the other. Because it was as the creative force came together in one and decided to divide itself into two. When it divided itself into both male and female. And so it is impossible for us to talk about moving forward in the 21st century if we do not have a balanced scale as it relates to issues, perceptions that relate to both the male and the female. And so some of the things that I think that we need to be able to do, and I want to get just very briefly into that, is to talk about relationships. Not simply male-female relationships, as sometimes in the United States we can get into, that really talks about who's loving whom and all of that. But just in terms of how do we behave and how do we interact and how do we make sure that when we sit down to talk about research, when we sit down to talk about problems and selecting issues as it relates to social issues, as it relates to psychological issues or whatever, that we are talking about a balance and that we're talking about looking at both things simultaneously. Very little has been written in a systematic way on the general history and culture of women of African ancestry that looks at our history from the dawn of civilization in Africa to the present time. And although there has been a significant increase in research, we still do not have a sort of comprehensive understanding of where we are as we approach the 21st century. More research are becoming available to us, but it seems to me that one of the key things that we need to do is to talk about collaborative research, not only within the U.S., and get away from some of this competitiveness that we feel, that we finally find some resource information, but we're not willing to share it with anybody, or we finally comprehend how something functions, and we're so out of line with our African spirituality that we don't call the sister or the brother up to say, look what I just found out, so that what I'm doing can make some progress. And it's obvious that we've got to start trying to do more things collectively. I cannot sit down and write that proposal by myself that is going to get funded, but 9 or 10 of us coming together and each of us writing 4 or 5 pages, and then somebody else in English like Mary, who's sitting down there who knows English and who can then take all of that and clean it up. And then we can talk about us all doing something collectively. And what we've been talking about over the last few days is how do we make sure that we just don't see ourselves as being confined to the United States of America, those of us who are in the U.S., but see that, as several speakers have suggested, more so than anybody else, we've been in the belly of the beast. We understand how the beast functions, and we need to be able to say to people who are just learning, hey, watch out. It's not going to be that way. We've been there for 400 years, and this is what has happened to us. You need to stay clear of this or that. So I am very much concerned about us trying to do some comprehensive things together. I would suggest to you that Black women's history, as is the case of any history, is a continuing process of reading, rereading, revising, and reconstructing. I think it is anything that Kemetic history teaches us, is that life is always becoming. You can never be satisfied with where you are, because where you were today is obsolete tomorrow. And so that we are always into being. That's what Kepra is about. Kepra is about always coming into being and renewing itself. And so I would suggest that we need to look at our history, reread our history, revise our history, and reconstruct our history. Just for a brief quote, I would suggest that there is a continuing question of how do we harness our history in the service of all of humanity, but in particularly, how do we harness our history in the service for African people, then how do we harness that in the service for women of African descent? And how do we do that in such a way that we bring along in that history our children and our spouses, those people that we relate to? We're not talking about creating anything that's going to be in opposition to anybody that you've got to fight to get through to that. So some of the very key questions that I'm concerned with as I'm trying to get more and more into this research is what roles did women play in classical African civilization? Dr. John Henry Clark, who's in our present and who's sitting there, says in one of his very classical pieces that the African woman is sort of at the cradle of civilization, and that you don't do anything without first addressing the whole issue of the woman, that the woman is the guardian of the royal pharaohs, that it comes through her. And looking and picking that up in terms of the things that Diop has said in his writing, says that thing which has upset Europeans is the centrality of women in African civilization. And regardless of what culture you go to, and Ghana is such a wonderful place to be because so much of Ghana is a matrilineal descent, that you have to stop and talk about the women. And when things are not going right in the community, the men say, go and get the women, and women make it sweet. Discern for us that which is true and that which we need to know. And in classical African civilization, when you see the symbol of Mayat, when you see this highest netter that talks about what we ought to be doing as a people, it is in the image of a woman. And it is the feather of Mayat that will do this final judgment to say where your heart, this heart of your mother. And so I constantly raise questions as I give presentations. It's like, are you doing what your mother told you to do? We have not gotten so far away from our existential basis that we don't realize some of the things that our mothers told us to do. And one of the things that they told us to do is that you treat people right. You treat people right. My mother used to say to me, there you can treat a dog right. And if you can treat a dog right, then surely you can treat another human being right. And as I'm going around talking to different people about what did their mothers say to them, cross-culturally, people of African ancestry, we're finding this continuity. And it is that kind of research, it seems to me, that we need to be getting into. What was the role of women in classical African civilization? What rights did they have? We find that in classical African civilization, women could own property, women could vote, women kept their names, all of those kinds of things. You see, and some of the things that we're dealing with in contemporary Western women's issues are not our issues. But we've gotten so far away from our own existential basis and our own history that we don't know what's going on. So it's a matter of reconstructing and reclaiming that and not buying into somebody else's stuff. So who were the black women in the Bible, for an example? That's a whole nother area of research. Because so many of us, when we see the, quote, Virgin Mary, we see somebody else having written their color into that history. That's right. And we find ourselves so locked into it that we cannot conceive of the Virgin Mary being other than a white European-looking woman, which could not have existed in that time nor that space. So much of our history simply means that we just need to reclaim it, reconstruct it, and put it in our own image. And as one person suggested, it would not have been necessary had they not put their own image in it. Because ancient Kemet people believed in the spirit, and the spirit has no form. But since form was put in it, then let's tell it like it is. So somebody who is that biblical scholar, and I know that you're out there, you know, then you need to go ahead and get into the color of these women in that time. What beliefs and values characterize ancient Kemet people, and how can we see those beliefs and values as we approach the 21st century? And if we've gotten away from it, what do we have to do to stop and reclaim that? For me, research is more than just research for research's sake. We know that if we go back to the ancient writings, which says that, knowledge is so that you can live right here. And so that they were able to do in ancient Kemet all of those things because they were very practical. So they use math, they use science, they use economics, Julian. They use all of that to bring us so that we can lead a better life. And we need to think about the 21st century of the research that we do is to help women, men, children move to a better life. So we can't get caught up in, if I do this research, will I get tenure? Or I can't say this in this way because the masses might understand it, but it's said in such a way that I won't be able to get this published in a certain kind of place. We've got to start doing more and more of our own writing, more and more of our own publishing, and women have got to start doing that. The brothers are beginning to do that. We're not investing in ourselves. Dolores Aldrin and I just published what I think is a very significant book on black women's health called River of Tears, The Politics of Black Women's Health. We wanted the book out, so we put it out. That's what we've got to start doing. If you got something you think is good, then take part of your salary, do 1,000 copies, and I'll help you distribute it. We've got a network all over the world. We can send these books. We cannot wait for somebody to confirm our research. We have to confirm our own research. And then as some of the things that I'm concerned with, what were the realities of black women in enslavement? We know their version of what happened to us in enslavement, but we don't know enough about our own version of what happened to us in the enslavement. And then one of the images, these contemporary images, and I had some other things, but I know my time is kind of limited. But what are these contemporary images of women of African descent? And the very sad thing is that we are finding as some of us in the U.S. are getting rid of these images that we've been stuck with for 50 and 40 and 100 years and finally deciding that, my hair is my hair. And no, I'm not straightening it anymore. And all of those other kinds of things we find that coming across the continent. All of those things that we have given up, they're now over here, wholesaling it to the sisters over here. And we've got to stop them early on with the psychological research that the young psychologist, Dr. Lewis, is doing, and those kinds of things to say that, listen, this is what's going to happen to your head, this is what's going to happen to your mentality if you go down this route trying to look like some white woman. In addition to that, if you know that the first person ever created in the world, which they now have to say that, they didn't want to say it, but the first person ever created in the world was a black woman 3.5 million years ago, and the creator can't make no mistakes. Why you want to be a copy of a copy? Why you want to imitate your children? So there's research that we need to do. Women on the continent who are beginning now, Naeem Ogbach said last night, or one of the speakers said, bleaching their skin. That we know is cancer producing. And some of us in the United States in the 40s and the 50s went through that. We don't need to have these sisters go through what we've already gone through, and we already know the research. I would just suggest to you that some of the things that we have to, first of all, be aware of, and we, women, need to start doing this kind of writing, but to take a look at all of these different positions, know that there are some writers, some of them are here, Donna Richards that's doing, I think, excellent work. Linda J. Myers is doing very excellent theoretical work. We've got to start quoting each other. That's how you get known. We've got to start quoting each other just like we quote anybody else. And so that if Donna Richardson let the circle be unbroken, then that's what we need to talk about. And Donna talks about, she says that to the African, the universe is made up of complementary pairs. The divine essence is both female and male. Ra exists, but so does Nut. Osiris exists, but so does Aset. You can't talk about one deity unless you talk about the other one, and they're always parallel, they're always balanced. And such has been life. We have never relegated females prior to folks that's coming and messing up with our own existential basis to know behind the scene kind of thing. That's not part of how we do things. And so when we know ourselves, and that's what Imhotep said, you got to know yourself first. Know yourself. When you know yourself, you have already saved yourself. But you've got to bear all of these baggages that we bring with us, thinking that it was Europeans who were the first people to think, the first people to do all of that, and please. When you know that we were writing, reading thousands of years before they came out of the ice caves, and they tell you that they came from out of there. And I say to people, can you imagine the Creator creating the original person in a cave? In the Garden of Eden tell you it wasn't that way in the first place. And those of you who believe in the Bible. You know, all I'm saying is so much of our history has been given to us in a false kind of way that we've got to tear off those layers. Before we can begin to do any kind of meaningful, significant research, we've got to tear off those layers. And those of us who are beginning to tear it off, soon as you tear off a layer, write about it. Write about it. Don't just hold on to it. And you can't be a perfectionist, like it's not quite ready yet. Just let it go. Let it go. Take the criticisms and clean it up the next time. Jackie told me my time is up, but I'm, ready for any questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And you will have an opportunity to dialogue more with Essie.
On. Our circumstances, our individual circumstances require heroic strength, and each one of us has had to be a hero in order to balance our lives and be where we are today. So I don't speak to you because I'm an expert. I speak to you because I share an experience, different in its manifestation, but the same in its essence. Ladies and gentlemen, the debate has been joined for years about the extent to which the African woman can take up the crusade for the determination of women's liberation from the perspective of the orthodox feminist movement initiated in Europe and America. There has been a strong sense of sisterhood, it must be recalled, as women of the world discovered an uncanny and tragic similarity in their fundamental circumstances all around the globe, never mind the external trappings. And yet, paradoxically, the widely varying contexts, both contemporary and historical, have made the determination of the priorities on a global basis virtually impossible. So it is that, to take a cliche, the bra-burning, anti-male brand of feminism has generally been unattractive to African world women, many of whom, in any case, don't have any bras to burn. Now, as part of the focus on Africa's lack of development, which cannot any longer be ignored by world powers, by world bodies, and so on. The question of Africa's lack of development has become an economic issue, a political issue, and it's not because people are necessarily being charitable. They can't sell their stuff. Because, if you can't read the label on some of these things, or you can't use a computer, you won't buy it, and so on. There are some very, very basic issues which has made it necessary for the question of the development of Africa to become a major concern. Now, out of this concern about the debilitating nature of the African problem, has come out a great deal of research in the past 10 to 15 years, that is making it much more or much easier for us to identify exactly what our problems are. Now, it would seem to me that a continuation of research, not by other people of African world women, but by African world women themselves, as my sister has said, has to be one of the most important issues that we have to look at, because, of course, if you're not doing it yourself, it does mean that somebody is telling your story. Ladies and gentlemen, the fact also that this lack of development is highly influenced by the question of human resources has come to the fore over the years. Now, Africa's human resource profile demonstrates that there is negligible participation in modern sectors. Now, I have to stress that, in modern sectors of socio-economic activity by women. That doesn't mean women are not working extremely hard, but they are working extremely hard in the informal sector. And the requirement for exponential growth, both in Africa's economy and in the activities of women themselves, is hampered, fettered by the lack of education of African world women, the lack of access to credit, the lack of the knowledge to be able to take advantage of technology and funding. And therefore, while there are many issues that we could touch upon, I just want to say that one of the major issues on the cards, given women's involvement and concern for the upliftment of a family, of a community, of a society, is how to be enabled to overcome their lack or their inability to participate fully in the modern sector. To become full participants, there is the need to take a very close look at both formal and non-formal education for African world women. For example, the questions that I think about are things like proper counseling so that women, girls, can be tracked into the fields that have the high potential for them to participate in. Every member of the family has to contribute to this. And if we do, as educationalists, how do we get to the girls and not just say that the girls must come to us? In other words, there has to be a very creative approach. Sometimes you're talking about an educational problem, but in order to resolve it, you have to dig a borehole so that there is water 2 minutes from the girl's house, and she doesn't have to walk so far to collect water. Or that you must plant a woodlot so that they don't have to walk far to collect firewood. Or that there must be a daycare center. In other words, the questions of education, when you look at them, in fact embrace a surprisingly wide range of areas, and there has to be a lot of creativity in policy making and activity for girls. Now, again, non-formal education becomes a very, very important problem. This is a major challenge because education, if we take on the concept of education for living and also for self-improvement, then there has to be an interaction between the formal and non-formal systems. We have to create re-entry points to admit people who haven't had a chance to complete the formal system and need to go back. There are a lot of rigidities in our educational systems, especially on the continent, that exclude people, that make people permanently excluded from self-improvement within the formal system. And I think that higher education systems are notoriously conservative, and I'm talking about conservative in the less helpful way. I mean, you can't be conservative in the sense that you believe in a good tradition, but I'm talking about the opposite of that. Now, I talk about this issue, I mean people who in the higher education system will say, well, it will affect our quality if we have quotas for women. Or to say that if somebody has gone through a lower system, say got a certificate or a diploma in teaching or nursing or whatever, we can't admit the person because when they were in high school, their math wasn't that good. And we really can't spend our energy trying to improve that. Those kinds of things are false problems, I believe, which we pose, and they affect women very particularly, because most women may have to, in fact, go into a profession or go into a technical area, and then they often have to go into their nurturing role and can only, in fact, begin to take advantage of the formal system at a later stage in their lives, and then these blockages are there. So I think that as we, many of us, professors, doctors, and so on, we can say, I got to this stage because I worked hard, because I'm intelligent, and so on and so forth. And I don't want my reputation to be ruined by this person trying to get in through the back door, and so on and so forth. I think that all that is a false problem, because if you are able to resolve a situation, to be able to bring out the creativity of people because you have been creative, that is a much more enhancing thing than sitting there on your own, one person on an 11, 12, 13, 14 member board and being the token woman. I mean, that is not the sort of thing that we should spend our lives cherishing. Ladies and gentlemen, let me continue by saying that there is what I've just said now concerns also the question of the glass ceiling. That is, those of us who manage to get into management positions or manage to get into positions which are mostly reserved for men. Now, I'm sure that all of you are aware of this concept of the glass ceiling, where you can't see it, but if you stand up, it will smash you down. Now, this is a very vital area because women have to get into policy-making position. You can't change things unless you can make the policies, and it is vital to get as many people in there as possible. So if we do have to use quotas, let's do it. That will only be the beginning. Later on, once you've opened the doors, and I'm sure that those of you who are African Americans know the value of this sort of approach. I then say that we have to be militant. And I don't say this with any sense of shame. I think that if we think that the time has come to relax, we are kidding ourselves. And that militancy also cannot be done on an individual basis. The question of working together becomes extremely critical because the forces that women have to fight against are so strong that I am sure it cannot be done on an individual basis. Support groups are vital. I just want to announce the coming into being of a forum of African women educators that has been set up in Nairobi, and which has women ministers, women vice chancellors, women principal secretaries of ministries of education, and their role is to force these issues now within this period of education for all before the 21st century and so on and so forth. It becomes clear that women in positions of power cannot see themselves as individuals but as representing their sisters and their society. Let me round off what I'm saying with one issue which I think we have to deal with, and that is the question of the male factor in this whole situation. I would like to make the point that the domestic situation, to me, is one of the most stressful problem areas for any woman achiever. any woman, period. And I think that, you know, the kind of attitudes that say that you have a colleague who will work with you, but if his wife was working with another person in this kind of situation of high stress and so on, he would say, not my wife. Now, how do you deal with that? Because it exists. And I think that a lot of women's potentials are just clamped down by being so tired of being confronted with this. So I would like to see some networking in support of young women of the African world who have the potential to move forward. I don't know how we're going to do that, but they must feel that somebody cares, that they can go out and do this, and their spirits will not be suppressed by this. I really feel very strongly about that, and I think that we should discuss it. But I believe that it may boil down to a very long a process that will be long, and that is the retraining of the male child. And that is something that we really have to look at very closely. I also believe that we have to create advocacy groups among men in order for them to take up this issue within their own gender community. And in this sense, I would like to cite a situation that is occurring in Ghana, which I think is wonderful, and that is, for example, in the area of family planning, a focus on men. Because it is not the woman who says that I want a 7th or 8th child most of the time. It's not, she's probably trying for a boy because he says that if you don't have it, I will go and have it elsewhere. So you have it. I mean, you know, that's how these things work out. The choice of what contraception to use is often controlled by men. And so this whole thing about gathering women together and telling them things that they know already bothers me a lot. It's the guys that need to change their attitude. So I really believe that a lot of work has to be done practically in creating advocacy groups on critical issues, and we shouldn't be afraid to talk about these things. I would then conclude by saying that just because the problems we are talking about are age-old, it does not mean that in our generation we shouldn't make our contribution to moving that one step forward that will finally end up in the resolution of the problem. I also believe that the problem has a global dimension but requires a very localized action. And therefore, you should not be afraid to do a little bit in your place where you are, like La Francis was saying, to resolve this. I also believe that African world women have so often said to themselves, my family first, my community first, my country first even. But that in order for us to really participate, we should begin to love ourselves and to improve ourselves. And then we will be strong enough to help other people. Now, again, I would like to say that this cannot, we cannot overemphasize the question of doing it together. The question of recognizing and rejoicing in the strengths that we have, of rejoicing in our diversities only as manifestations, knowing that the essence is whole and one, and looking to and keeping our eyes on the essential goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will now hear from Sharon Bailey.
Hotep brothers and sisters, I feel overwhelmed to be here with my doctor friends. I'm one of those ABD people who just kind of hang out in the rafters.
One eye, so don't worry.
But, you know, I would like to thank Dr. Rose and, for making sure that I was able to make this sojourn to the continent again this year, because it's an opportunity, and I think we all see it as an opportunity to re-energize, to rethink, to reevaluate where we are, and to begin to reformulate our perspectives on some critical issues that impact our lives. And this is my first time in Ghana, but I think all of us have sort of picked up the vibe that we're all here for a reason. Dr. Akbar last night talked about the momentum and the movement of the spirit that has brought us all here at this particular point in time. And I guess I'm concerned about what we're going to do with that energy. What are we going to do with that momentum and that feeling that has brought us here? And so we are charged to move the agenda. And, you know, I think as we continue the discussion over the next few days, and as you all conclude your conference, it's important that we begin to talk about where we go from here. I have participated in international women's meetings and women's issues kinds of forums beginning in Nairobi in 85. And it was the end of the decade of women, and as African women, we were very aggressive in our participation in those efforts. And we were putting issues on the table and establishing a framework for action. And a strange thing, when that decade ended, and as we moved forward to Moscow in 1989, there was a different kind of feeling there. As African women, we emerged in Moscow, from all around the world, and we were just sort of there. I didn't feel the same energy, the same agenda, and we were overwhelmed by the Europeans and the little Japanese women running around, and it was just very chaotic, but our presence was not felt. And so folks came to Dr. Rose and they said, well, could you pull together a meeting so as African women we could continue to discuss those issues that are important to us? And we found ourselves, you know, gathering folks together and continuing to pull together that agenda. But my feeling is if we let it go, as was said before, we're going to be overlooked. We're going to be neglected in terms of our real issues and those things that are of concern to us. And so there is confusion, and we do need to reevaluate and rethink where we're going. And I think part of the confusion does have to do with our focus on that broad, burning, radical feminism that was not attractive, that did not address the issues of racism and sexism on a level that we could relate to. So we do need to begin to look at those issues from a womanist point of view. And I think the title of this particular panel, in terms of womanist, really lifts it out of some of the darkness. Alice Walker, she talks about a womanist as being one who is committed to the survival of the wholeness of an entire people, male and female, and that the centrality of family and community in terms of human development becomes the focus, and it's not self-interested, it's not just about women, but it's about the community. And looking at our situation from a holistic point of view, I tend to be an interdisciplinarian, knowing that it's important to not only understand the political, but the economic and the social, cultural ramifications of any issue. Those issues of family and community should be central to addressing those issues in health, in politics, and education, and the violence and crime that are in our cities, the drug abuse problems, work and economic development. So we know the problems, and we've agreed here that we're not going to dwell on those problems. We also understand the essential elements of creating and formulating the answers to those problems. And I guess I'm a very frustrated policymaker, as the only African American on a policymaking board, on the Board of Education in Denver. You know, I find that the struggle to save African American children is becoming more difficult than it ever has been. And, you know, I'll step out there and challenge the mostly Anglo Union and look behind me and there's nobody there. And so you begin to wonder as you continue to struggle where are the folks? And what is it that we need to be doing to bring everybody to the table, from the grassroots folks to the people who make policy in the state houses. So we need to begin to look at those issues about how we can bring folks together. I guess, we all talk a good game. We've become very good as nationalists or whatever we are in terms of talking a good game about revolution. But when it comes down to the practical application of some of those things we already know, again, the implementation piece is really where we need to be focusing, I believe. And what I find is that, when I get real frustrated, Denver, Colorado is at a fairly high altitude, and the pollution is pretty severe. And when I just can't come up with any answers as to why African Americans in Denver, Colorado aren't getting down to the extent that they are, I have to say it's the altitude. It's the pollution. Because Lord knows, I cannot really justify the lack of action. So I see a lack of balance, that ma'at that Dr. Rose referred to in terms of some of the kinds of things that we're doing as a people. The lack of balance in understanding our African selves and the duality that Du Bois talked about in terms of looking through the veil and understanding the oppressor and being able to read the situation and move forward from that. And we don't do that very well. When I look at MCS, which is sort of the middle class syndrome, and I think it happens globally in terms of people feeling that they have arrived and denying their African self and the power of being the first people. And to me, that's a very, very severe problem, and it brings that imbalance. Right now, we're hearing a lot of discussion about saving the African American male, and they are an endangered species. But again, the lack of balance. I think the African American female is just as much at risk. African females are just as much at risk. So we need to develop the rites of passage programs for Black females. We need to pay as much attention to their needs as we are in terms of focusing on our males, because women do hold up half the sky. And we cannot, again, the lack of balance, we tend to go one direction and tip the scales to the point where we become totally ineffective in terms of reaching out to our young people. And we do, in terms of looking at the way things happen in our communities, for example, we overemphasize the political. We deal with politics every day, and we forget that we can't move socially, culturally, without that economic base. So again, another issue of balance in terms of where we're going as a people. We need to make sure that all areas are covered. In terms of the academicians, again, another area where I think we lack balance. I've been to the National Alliance of Black School Educators and the Association of Behavioral and Social Scientists and the National Association of Black Studies, and we get together and we talk and we share our research. But somehow, that information, again, we've talked about this, that we have, never gets to the policymakers in our community who can make a difference with the information. It never gets to the practitioners in our community who are working with the grassroots people who need to understand those things that we talk about at our meetings. So somehow we have to begin to bridge that gap in terms of where we're going and what we're doing in terms of making a difference with our people. And so we need to do more than talk with each other and develop the sense of camaraderie that we gather at these meetings. So we need to talk about it, and I think the challenge to you all who are participating in this conference is, we're on the other side of the globe. How are we going to let folks know throughout the planet what's going on at this meeting? I feel it's important for somebody, I don't know whether there's any press in the environment or somewhere that we may have access to, but I think this is a very historical moment for us. And we need to be about making sure that folks understand that we were here and that we were here to make a difference in terms of African folks around the world, and that we are moving the agenda. And we need to let folks know. So I challenge you all to figure out a way that we can move this meeting beyond Ghana, that we can move forward. I guess we also need to look at the fact that all the theories, all the perspectives, all the rhetoric in the world makes no difference. It will make no difference unless there's action, positive change, and finally healing amongst our people. We've got a lot of healing to do. And as Black women and African women, you know, we need to be able to go through cycles where we can begin to heal, where we can begin to renew ourselves, where we can begin to rejuvenate, because the struggle continues. And again, as Sister said here, it's not over. The militancy is going to have to be an ongoing issue for us. It's not time to back up. And as I deal with the African American children in my own community, I begin to wonder, you know, what we're going to do, because time is running out. As we move toward the next millennium, if we are not prepared, if we do not have agenda, and we're good as folks are putting agendas together. I have developed more agendas in my community with no action. It's a shame. So I stopped even dealing with it, you know, and I'm sort of a political outcast because I am about action. So we need to start forcing the issues, and we need to make our folks accountable. All right. You know, we can talk to the powers that be, and we can argue with them and fight with them and bring about no change. And that's not where the change has to take place. It has to take place within us. It has to take place within our families. It has to take place within our communities. And the only way that we can get to that is if we begin to challenge one another to make a difference. We can no longer feel comfortable that we have arrived. We can no longer feel comfortable that the struggle is over, because it is not. So my challenge to this conference is for us to begin again to move the agenda and to determine whatever it's going to take in terms of a platform or agenda that can reach around the world to let folks know that we're serious. Folks do not, the man does not take us seriously because we have not been about serious action. So I'll be going back to the U.S. in a few days, but I hope to hear sometime next week in Denver, Colorado, that y'all were kicking it and making a difference, and that it not stop with Accra, Ghana, that we continue to meet and convene, but we also make some difference in our own communities. That's it for me.
It is a pleasure for me to be here to join in this discussion. In Ghana and in Africa generally, the women's issue became something that came to the fore during the UN Decade for Women. And most of us were very much involved in the activities that took place at the time, and I was in Nairobi and also in Copenhagen before that. And it was quite clear that the agenda for the African women was slightly different from the agenda for the women from Europe and other places. And in the discussions, it became clear that we in Africa have a slight dilemma. On the one hand, we have the image of the woman in most of the matrilineal societies where the woman is a very powerful force to reckon with. I think most of you know about the Queen Mother types, those who are consulted. I think the first speaker did talk about that. The women who help, who actually make the decisions, even though maybe it's the male chief who announces it. But we have that image of the powerful woman matriarch, the Queen Mother. The Ashantis in Ghana have the woman, Yasantua, who actually led an army against the British when the Ashanti chief was sent into exile. Then so we have those women in the matrilineal societies. And on the other hand, we have the women in the predominantly patrilineal societies of Eastern and Southern Africa, where the system of bride wealth is such that when a woman gets married, the amount of bride wealth he has to produce is so great that the woman virtually becomes the man's property. So that when it comes to divorce, because her family has to return all the things that the man provided, she just cannot afford to have a divorce because the family would already have used up whatever it is that was given. And so we have the two extreme images of the woman as a powerful force in the family and the woman as the servant of the man in the home. Now, so for us, we realize that the traditions within which we have grown are sometimes the main source of the problem for women, for women's advancement. And so a lot of research work has been going on trying to identify these customs that are detrimental to the status of women, trying to find out what is good about those customs so that one can preserve them, what is not so good for the progress of women so that we can do something about them. And so I'm sorry, I've just come from a funeral and it's a very good friend, so I have them. So we have women who have been trying to identify some of these problems and work towards them. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we've been trying to do in Ghana. For example, we have the Federation of Women Lawyers who have been working very hard to try and improve the legal literacy for women. So they have tried to identify particularly the laws that affect women directly and have been translating these laws into various Ghanaian languages, have written them up in very simple English, little booklets that they are selling to people so that women will know what their rights are and how to defend those rights. I must say that the Federation has got branches all over Africa, and these people have been working together, been holding meetings and trying to see which are the best strategies to deal with the problems. The women lawyers have also, they started legal aid for women in Ghana some years ago, and fortunately the judicial service in Ghana has also now decided that there should be legal aid for those who can't afford the services of lawyers. And it's really amazing how much these women have been able to do to help women who have child maintenance problems, you see, when men refuse to look after their children, and women who also have had problems with matters of inheritance. Because in most of Ghanaian society, a woman does not automatically inherit her husband's property. Even sometimes children normally didn't. A new law has been passed which makes this possible, but because the tradition has been there for so long, there are a lot of women who don't even attempt to use the law to their advantage. And so they need to be encouraged to take advantage of the law which was designed to help them. One of the things that we've also tried is to improve the economic power of women, because we realize that particularly in Ghana, in West Africa generally, we do have the market women who are a real force to reckon with. They control a lot of the money flow in the country, and invariably they get used by politicians who use their expertise in fundraising and organizational ability to get them elected into parliament, and then they forget them. I must say, of course, the women are smarter than that, so they use the politicians to get access to the goods that they need to trade in so they can make more money. But the thing is that we realize that economic power for women does actually improve a woman's status. because the family respects her because she can contribute to the development of the, to the education of the children and things like that. And so women have really, in the past decade and a little bit, since the Women's Decade, there have been a lot of activity in Ghana trying to help women have access to credit, access to land to farm, and access to all sorts of facilities so that they can improve on their economic activity and thereby improve their own status in the society. Then one of the issues we've been dealing with is also making sure that we can have women in policy-making positions. AC mentioned the fact that, of course, if you can change things, you must change it from the top. Those making the policies really must be there, must be sensitized to issues affecting women. And it's incredible sometimes when you serve on some of these committees how very ignorant, I'm afraid, the men are about some of these things, because they just are not sensitive to the problems that women face. They will, they just take a whole lot of things for granted, but when they become sensitized to these things, I must say that they become some of the best allies in the fight for women's rights. Now, as far as that is concerned, there have been various strategies that we've tried to use, like having a directory of women in various professions and so on, so that we can advise that these people can be put on policy-making boards. And over the years, we've been able to at least persuade various governments that they must try to have women on various positions. Unfortunately, it ends up being quite often the token woman, because the law says, there should be so many people, at least one of whom should be a woman, and the at least is satisfied, and that's it. So we don't move forward. But there are more and more women in various professions in Africa now, and most of these women are really pushing ahead. Nigeria, for example, is a country where women have really got into politics in a big way, and Ghana isn't doing too bad. At least now we have 16 women in parliament, a parliament of 200, but we'll get there eventually. I was talking to an Austrian lady once, and she said she is in parliament because her political party insisted that they should field at least 50% of the candidates for the party should be women. And I thought that that's a very good idea that we can sell to our own people here. Because after all, the women are supporting the parties with their money and their organizational ability. And if they put down the rules and say that we must have a certain number of women fielded by our party, we will probably end up having at least 30 to 40% of women parliamentarians in our parliament. Then we've also have groups in Ghana that are dealing with human rights, women's human rights, the problem of violence against women within the home and in the society, in the workplace, and so on, the harassment that women go through and all that. And I must say that now that we're beginning to talk about these things, people are becoming aware of what is happening, and people are even now prepared to talk about things like that. It's really surprising when in recent weeks we've had in the Ghanaian newspapers cases of rape actually reported and discussed in the papers and discussed in the courts, because in the past people wouldn't even dare to talk about it. But now people are becoming sensitized, but they realize that this is a violation of their rights, and so they're becoming conscious about it and discussing it. And I think this is a healthy sign, and the more people get to know about these things, maybe the more something can be done about it. Now, I think that I find this forum a very useful one, because I think in the United States, you've been able to develop certain strategies for helping the women's cause. I know that you've got various groups that help women when they want to stand for elections and that sort of thing. And maybe it will be useful to learn from you in the general discussion some of the strategies that you have used to improve the status of women in your own society, and then we can have the benefit of your experience during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, you all will have to excuse my informality. I'll just say, yo. Jackie asked me to.
That's right, let me say. First of all, I
Story on myself, which will help you understand what I'm going to say. Bev Smith and I, and those of you from the States know Bev Smith is the moderator of Our Voices, sat on a panel once, and she said, well, we African Americans are so strange from each other. I think everybody should stand up and give each other a hug. So they did, and everybody felt real good. So now I'm next to you and tell her how much money you make. And somebody dropped in the room. In other words, I think that while we can talk quite a bit about some of the stuff from the spiritual, etc., approach, we also have to get down to the real deal, which for me is the economic deal. And this is said to not to step on toes, but just to be real about where women are, and especially African American women and African women. In preparing to come to this conference, I began to look at lots of the data on where women were in the developing world and the labor market numbers. And Essie, you were very helpful in talking about the whole issue of informal versus formal sectors, because some recently released UNESCO numbers suggest that women in the African world, for example, don't participate in the formal labor market at the same level that we do in the States. But then when you look at the informal labor market and the grappling that we've attempted to do with the underground economy and informal labor market, you see reflective themes. So I think that we need to talk about some of these economic themes and the extent to which we in the States as African American women, and I would not speak for African women as well, but I think to some extent here as well, our economic needs are subverted to the notion of African American gaps or gaps in the African world, so that in looking at what is happening externally, we fail to raise discussions about what's happening internally. Divided against ourselves, I think Rosemary Bray called it in her Hers column in the New York Times in the wake of the Clarence Thomas debacle. What she talked about was the extent to which we are often nationalized, if you will, into silence because it's not for the greater good or the cause. I think that we as women of African descent, be it African or African American, need to talk very much about what the cause is in the context of who we are. And I think we have to be very careful about our language. Again, I don't intend to step on anybody's toes, but I probably will in saying that I wish the words endangered man were banished from our vocabularies. Why do we use this kind of language? I mean, I'm writing an essay right now called Can You Love an Endangered Man? Basically, I don't think you can. An endangered man is like a monument, like the Washington Monument or the Lincoln Monument. Some you gotta polish, care and feed. I don't want anything I have to care and feed and polish and have somebody guard. I mean, when I think of endangered species, I think of like bald-headed eagles, red-spotted owls, salmon that go the wrong way in the stream. It is depersonalizing to talk about our men as, quote, endangered men, and we take on the language of the oppressor. It's also passive. I mean, Rodney King did not lay down somewhere and was hit 56 times by blows that were unconnected to human hands. I mean, we can talk about a war on the black man. We can talk about the way the black man is placed in danger. But, you know, endangered is something entirely else that's connected to the 19th century eugenics movement when people attempted to say that we were different kinds of persons, that our personhood was different. Now, in a session on womanist issues, why am I focusing on the endangered man? Because the endangered man is connected to another very debilitating myth, and that's the myth of the broad-shouldered woman. In other words, we can take it all, okay? Man on crack, I can take that. Child in trouble, I can take that. Single-headed household, I can take that. Just continue to pile it on, which is how you then get all these health and other indicators for African American women that are so far projected from those of others. Colon cancer, 3 times as high. These are the things that we get because we want to be the broad-shouldered women taking care of the endangered men. And what needs to happen instead is that we need to have some dialogue in our communities about male responsibility, some hard-hitting dialogue, and it can be loving. It doesn't have to be hateful, but it has to happen. It absolutely has to happen. I think we, again, have just all too often found ourselves not willing to have that kind of dialogue because we can all recite the ugly statistics, which if I hear them one more time, I will probably become ill in public, so I won't recite them. But you know the ones I mean about too many people, more people in jail than in college. I mean, that's actually not quite true, but you know, you hear those numbers and they're recited. They become part of a litany. Just like the litany that we heard on the Moyers Report, y'all remember that one? 70% of all black men by the year 2000 will be in jail, on drugs, unemployed. Well, I want to know what the numerator was and what the denominator was when you got numbers like that, or was that simply wishful thinking? Because the title of the series was Wishful Thinking, The Vanishing Black Family. I mean, that in many ways seemed to me to be wishful thinking. I, in the wake of that, actually called many family members. They said the vanishing black family. I called my mother, she was home. My brother and sisters were home. I called my dad. We didn't talk but once quarterly. We had a quarterly date to talk. But I broke my quarterly date to call him early to make sure he was home because if the black family was vanishing, I wanted to say goodbye. You know, and it occurred to me sort of midway through this, I really did this. I mean, people think that I tell these stories because I like to tell jokes, but no, I really pulled off because I was in one of my weird days and I took it literally. So I pulled off the side of the road, started making these phone calls, and I was like, oh, white people are lying again. And we, you know, and we fell for it again. But the images that we get in terms of vanishing families, et cetera, are images that we buy. Another image we've bought is the stigma around single-headed households. Now, that stigma is a stigma that we've allowed people to enter into the dialogue, so the word single head of household suddenly becomes pejorative. But what is the alternative? Those mothers could have left. I mean, the alternative is that these women could have been charged with child abandonment. So it seems to me that we have to take back some of the language about who we are as women as opposed to simply taking on the ways that other people describe us. And of course, this does echo what many of my co-panelists here have said. But I think that in economic terms as well, we need to take back what people are defining as productive activity and unproductive activity. The left has had this conversation time and again in the context of the states about what is employment and unemployment, what is welfare, and what is simply an industrial subsidy, if you will. You know, what kind of inactivity is to be rewarded, i.e. when crops are just sitting there. You know, now these people who didn't plant crops are going to get 23% of the crops they did not plant in the wake of the Mississippi River flood. This is real interesting. I mean, they didn't plant the crops, now they're going to get paid for not planting them because the crops they didn't plant got flooded. Okay, 23%. But meanwhile, we're hearing that, you know, we have cut the unemployment insurance subsidy from 26 weeks back to 13 in several states, including New York State. Now, this may not mean a lot to folks who are not from the states, and I have to, again, apologize for not being more global in my analysis. But I think that it is important for, as our sisters have talked about, some of the issues in terms of, especially as the whole intersection of household work and family, which is something I think we've talked about a lot in both women's studies as opposed to African American studies, which is something else I'll get to in a minute, in the States. I think that there are reflective issues that we can pick up from and learn from in terms of each other. And there's some things that we've done in the States and some questions that we raise in the context of role of government that we might well collaborate on. I think that part of the problem in talking about some of these issues is that there has not been a great big place for women's studies in the context of Africana studies, African American studies, and et cetera. And part of that is the part of it that says that much of this is just culture and humanities and not the social sciences, or cultural humanities and history and not the economics and the other stuff. Because when we begin to talk about that, then we can begin to talk about family as economic unit. We can begin to talk about public policy and its role in either buttressing or fragmenting families. We can begin to talk about the spatial location of things like factories, like toxic pollutants, like other things, and what that does to the entire fabric of African American life and in greater context, women's life, to the extent that women pull that together. A few numbers for the, just because I have to have numbers wherever I go, I have to have them. If I didn't have them, I'd have a problem. But I think one of the things that we have to look at vis-a-vis these numbers, because it's very easy to talk about the quote broad-burning feminists, and I don't really hang out with them too much either, but the numbers about labor markets really talk about one group of people in labor markets doing very well and other groups doing very poorly. If you look at weekly wages, for example, in the United States, the average white man earns $575 a week. White woman, $390. Black man, $388 or something. Black woman, $350. So what you see is this humongous gap between the $575 and the threes, if you will. And so I think that all too often, and recent data on, quote, feminism sort of bears me out. All too often we can divide along issues of abortion, bra burning, if you will, sexual orientation, and other things, but where women across nations as well as within nations come together and are most concerned are around economic issues. The Ms. Foundation for Women just did a fascinating study where they actually oversampled for the first time in their life for African American women, Latinas, and Asian women, and found alarming unanimity, alarming in the good sense, unanimity of focus on issues of equal pay. Equal, as opposed to, I mean, all these other issues that you would think people would get excited about because of the headlines, as I said, you know, abortion, et cetera. They were way down the list. They were in the top 10, but they were down at like 7, 8, et cetera. So the issues that really sort of made people's temperature rise are what were people paid, what were the child care arrangements, and what was equal treatment on the job. And I think that in terms of looking at womanist issues, we're now at a sort of a third generation of looking at race and gender gaps in the workplace. And the first generation was simply looking at the issue of equal pay, just, you know, who is paid what. The second generation issues start talking about issues like pay equity, but the third generation of issues really need to place women's issues in the broader global context of economic restructuring, which suggests that, first of all, we're not players at the table at all. Whenever the G7 meets, I crack up. You know, we used to be like, you know, 6 white men and an Asian man sitting around the table. Now they got a white woman. So, you know, pretty much, but you know, these white folks sit around the table with Japan, representing something like, I don't know, probably 20% at most of world production, talking about what ought to happen to everybody else's production. The missing piece of that for peoples of color, both in the States and in the world, is that they are relying on the dependent position of a whole bunch of people to talk about advancing their own production. The growth rate in Ghana, quiet as it's kept, is more rapid than the growth rate in the United States right now. Ghana's economy is growing at about 5 to 6%. The U.S. economy at, if we're lucky, 3%. And this is reflected in some of the other countries, so that part of the discussion around some of these issues has to be how we fit into global economies and how some of these rules, at a precipitous moment, I think, because a number of things are breaking down, how some of these rules get to change. And why I say that it's a precipitous moment is because one of the most challenging things that's happening is that large multinationals are breaking down because they simply cannot stand the weight of being dinosaurs, which means that there are opportunities for things like micro-enterprise. When candidate Clinton was running, he talked about that. But in some work with the UN, I've seen them do things on micro-enterprises and women in developing countries. So this does really raise the question about how this economic chaos, which is what it ultimately is, can be managed so that African peoples, people of color and people of African descent, end up with a bigger piece of the pie after chaos than before it, because the micro-enterprise challenge is an exciting challenge. I think this is something that I haven't heard people talk about very much, and I think that we need to talk about and place into some kind of a context. One of the other things that I want to say in the context of talking about womanist issues, there was this decade of the woman that began with Nairobi, and in the States we had the Year of the Woman last year. And you really have to wonder, is it the Year of the Woman or the Women of the Year? The decade of the women, or the women of the decade, because what we can see is notable gains among a very small group of people, and then you want to know, how does that trickle down?
what does the fact that Sister X or Sister Y got position X or position Y really mean to the homie in the hood? And this is something that has to be broken down in the context of people who are earning that $350 a week, because ain't none of them here, quite frankly. And, we need to talk about that in terms of the trickle down, because you see something like President Clinton saying, well, I'm going to sign the ban on importation, lift the ban on importation of RU-486. So now anybody who wants to can bring RU-486, an abortion pill, into the United States. How many people are prepared to jump on a Concorde, go get the pill, and bring it back? I mean, it does not change the material conditions of very many women. The House Family and Medical Leave Act was passed, but it excludes people who work for corporations with fewer than 15 employees. So you just have excluded half of all workers. Half of all women. So there's a lot of rhetoric around womanist issues that I don't think that we break down, and I find all too often myself growing incredibly impatient with the rhetoric. Since people have made announcements here, let me make one and do some challenging as well. I was last week elected to Vice President of the National Association of Negro Business and Professional Women. I would invite any of the sisters here who are from the States as well as from out of the States to join. In my role, I am program chair, which means that my challenge is to talk about how programmatically we can improve the status of African American women and African women around the world using because we do have an international, our 7th region is actually an international region, around issues of health, education, employment, and economic development, which are our program thrust. I chose to, a number of my friends said to me, what's wrong with you? It is a traditional organization, and I clearly am someplace over there. But I chose to take on the challenge because I think that far too often we have attempted to reinvent and recreate the wheel and start a new organization because the old one wasn't functioning or because we weren't sufficiently challenged. Among the biggest issues that I think that African American women and women in the African world have to deal with are the voices of some women have been created, and that has caused the silences of others. There are many sisters who do not have voices, and one of the stories that I like to tell is the story of Brenda Patterson. And the reason and I won't tell it today, but I may tell it later. Brenda Patterson was the person who was named plaintiff in Ward's Cove versus Patterson, which was one of our EEOC cases. No one in 12 years came to this sister's defense, but eventually the NAACP, a Legal Defense and Education Fund, and yet you found the rush of white feminists around Anita Hill. Anita Hill's voice came at the expense, if you will, of Brenda Patterson, and this is neither to diss Anita or to deify Brenda Patterson, but to say that when we have voices, we have the responsibility to raise them globally. Issues of class are issues that African American women have not talked about nearly enough, so that there becomes a notion that simply by being you have done. And that simply is not the case, and that really connects to the year of the Woman of the Year. So let me simply put that out there and close by saying that in some of the words of folk like Paula Gidding, when and where we enter, issues of race and gender come with us. There are clear differences between African American feminists, African feminists, and European feminists. And I use the word feminist quite deliberately because I'm not going to let anybody tell me that there's anything wrong with being a feminist. I am not, because someone connects Robert to the F word. I mean, the F word has to be that we claim language as we see it, womanist too, but also feminist. And the differences among those groups are not so great that we can't talk about things like how women can move their economic interests and the extent to which law, economic structures, and policy disadvantage women across the board. Thank you.
Our panelists for such a magnificent job in giving us.
If I heard the question right, the question was in ancient Kemet society were women able to enter the mystery schools, and the answer to that is yes. There is a book that I have with me, which is a very good book to read. It's called Ancient Egypt and Black Africa by Dr. Obinga, who was and who's now chair of the the institute that Diop had at the University of Dakar. And in this, he has a chapter on women in ancient Kemet. And he mentions the fact that there were women priests, women viceroys, and a number of roles. But what has happened, which is another piece of research that we need to do, and that is we need to go back and look at that history and go and do some of that research and go to the Brooklyn Museum where a lot of these things are held, and go to wherever and begin to go in and read specifically looking at the role of women in those times, so that we can bring that up and become a part of our collective history today. But the answer is yes.
Patriarchal, actually it's matrilineal and patrilineal societies and how they developed and what the position is. Actually, I wouldn't know how they developed. I think I'll need an anthropologist or a sociologist to explain that to you. But we do have in Ghana the two systems operating. The matrilineal societies trace the family, the lineage, through the woman, so that every child in that society belongs to his mother's family. You don't belong to your father's family. And therefore, when you talk about an uncle, the uncle must be your mother's brother, okay? And your father's relations, actually, you are not part of your family. And because of that, women are really treasured in those societies. And so if a woman was married and she had a difficult marriage, the man was mistreating her or something like that, she can just walk out of that marriage and her family, her brothers and everybody will support her. But and because of, again, the fact that the woman is looked on as somebody who is helping the family to expand, to grow, when she gets married, the man is looked on as somebody who is going to help her family increase their lineage. And so he only gives a token symbol for cementing the relationship between his family and her family. And therefore, in fact, among the Ashantis, traditionally, it used to be a bottle of drink or something like that, something quite token. So, as everywhere in Africa, when there is a divorce, you return whatever it was that the man gave. And so in that society, the woman herself can even go and buy the drink and say that, tell her family, I don't want to marry. But in the patrilineal system, the woman then is seen as helping her husband to increase his lineage. Okay, so the woman's family then loses her services in the family and all that. She actually now is, quote unquote, working for the husband's family. And because of that, he compensates the woman's family by giving them what is called the bride wealth. And in Ghana, the bride wealth among the patrilineal society isn't really very big. But in the Southern African situation, a man can give even as many as 40 or 60 cows for marrying that one woman. And when you have a marriage situation like that, usually the woman's brothers are waiting for her to get married so they can get enough cattle to marry a woman. So by the time, if she really was in a terrible marriage and she wanted to leave, the cows would just not be there to return to the man. And so she has to stay in, and that is where it becomes difficult. That's, I know that some people have the image of the African woman as a slave and, of her husband, but it is that has given that image. Mm-hmm. And, but I can assure you that I've been in Swaziland and Botswana and those places, and it's interesting to see the sort of bonding that takes place among co-wives of a man. And when they want to get their way with a man, they do. So that's the situation. But I really have no idea how it developed. It just happens that in Africa you have these two major systems. of inhabitants. Thank you.
Unrelated at all. I just think, I think we've got to get down to the real deal at some level. And so my role as a public intellectual is to talk about economics and public policy. And quite frankly, I leave the discussions of a whole bunch of things that I don't know a whole lot about to other folk. Now, in terms of, I think that obviously there is some inhumanity that is inbred in capitalism. And there is an issue of whether or not you can have a, quote, compassionate capitalism. I mean, I think this is the discussion that a number of people are having about the way, or if there is an alternative to capitalism that also works. So-called radical economists have had these discussions forever in the wake of Marx, who wasn't paying attention to us. So that's another issue that can be talked about later. But the economic left constantly talks about what alternatives to capitalism might be and how then you would do issues of allocation. And obviously, in a system that is both hierarchical and competitive, issues of spirituality, issues of any kind of balance go out of the window. In a hierarchical and highly competitive system as well, I mean, obviously you could justify not only slavery, but if you look at the 80s in the context not only of the United States, but let me put it in the context of the United States because it very much does impact our relation to the rest of the world. The extent to which the Reagan-Bush revolution had to do with deregulation, the deification, if you will, of the free market. The outcome of that was, as I probably don't need to remind anyone here, in terms of OSHA, the Hamlet, North Carolina fire, where 25 people, 18 of them African-American women, died because people were afraid that people might steal chicken wings. More immediately in Northern California, we recently had yet another toxic spill where some 8,000 people were apparently affected, and all of this has to do with the deregulation, if you will, of OSHA. Now, the other thing that had to do with is our exportation of, for example, pajamas treated with tris and other polluted goods, the extent to which tobacco and alcohol from the United States are sent all over the world. And as we know that, you know, people of color, African American women under age 23 are the fastest growing increased rate of smokers. So, you know, there is something about capitalism that breeds an inhumanity, and this is something from an economic theory perspective that we tend to continue to explore. It also leads to an inhumanity in how we've chosen to deal with foreign aid, what our influence has been in terms of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, how we've attempted to force people and to place hierarchies on when we do intervention and why around the world. So these are questions that from a theoretical standpoint I struggle with, as I think most economists of conscience, which may be a large or small group depending on where you sit, do struggle with. I don't know if that quite answers it. So, you know, I think that there are clear issues. I think another set of issues as you deal with informal economies in the context of capitalism is how you measure informality, what you think about that. Then you get to the six-figure crisis. Do you become a social worker or an investment banker, and how do you contextualize those kinds of choices? I think there are rules for ethics, or not rules. There is a place for ethics and values in the context of discussions about the economy, and have engaged in those kind of discussions with folks. I think, though, I do have I'll cop to it. I have an impatience with with an over-discussion of spirituality that does not connect to public policy or to real deal issues. And I do have an impatience with that I don't struggle with. I know it's an impatience that I have, and so I don't deal with it. Also silent, Lonnie Bonnier was flashed by all over this. We did that statement, especially about the Confederate flag, was incredibly important, and I think it really speaks. I mean, we're in an administration where people don't want to talk about race, and Bonier's nomination, as she has subsequently said time and again, and the withdrawal of her nomination was essentially the postponement of a debate that has to take place. Carol's threat of filibuster moved it forward a tiny step. I don't think that we took a giant step forward, but I think it was a step forward. And I think that system will have to be challenged. I think somewhere this morning people talked about inside-outside roles in the multicultural education summit, was it, workshop? That she will have to continually be challenged by us to raise her voice more often. Because one of the key disappointments for me around what happened to Lonnie Guinier was that not only was Senator Mosley Braun silent, but the 3 white women who were elected because of the so-called Anita Hill effect also did not seem to be able to find their lips nor tongues in that debate. So with all due respect to the Confederate, there have been several other times when the sister might have filibustered, and I hope that she will find some time to filibuster again.
And one of the externalities or circumstantial issues that I was talking about, because at least on this continent, except for South Africa, we are ruling ourselves or attempting to do so. That puts you in a completely different framework. It is therefore not heinous to be in government or to aspire to be in government. The issues of compromise that come up in the American context when you're dealing with government are not the same when you have a country like this. The question is that if we are saying that we are ruling ourselves and setting the agenda, then we have got to be very, very visible, very, very vocal, and to participate. The other thing, of course, is that since the word global is featuring and ought to feature in this discussion, I would just like to say that we gain nothing from being absent from bodies that have a global dimension. I want to say that we want to see more African American people in WHO, in FAO, in various organizations, because this is where the world affairs are being managed at the moment. This is where the big money is being distributed. And it does get distributed depending on the orientation of the people who are in control. Now, a right-thinking African person, of course, there are many Africans, African Americans and other Africans who don't see themselves routing for Africa. And that's not the sort of person I'm talking about. I am prejudiced in favor of those who see themselves as pushing an African agenda within a global context. So I just want to make that clear. But we do need to see you. I have been in policy-making positions where I need consultants. I have to spend money on them, and I don't have any African-American consultants, so I take a Yugoslavian or somebody. Where are you? So it's very important to think global in the context of attempting to influence the type of situation that's happening at the moment.
Thank you.
I'd like to.
Ms. Malraux has already set us on a path that is very vital, and that is the quote informal sector and the bringing that into the modern formal sector. As she said, I thought it was very, very interesting to state that out of the economic chaos that is occurring today globally, we would make sure that we had a bigger chunk after the chaos. And pertaining to microeconomics, I think that it may be elsewhere during this conference, the question of linking up small businesses and small use of technology at the micro level in order to mop up all the resources that we have, but which are in little pockets, is a vital issue that has been raised by the speaker, and I'm sure that is where the discussion should take place.
As I talk to young people, African American children in my community, I encourage them in their education as they begin to pursue their careers to become world citizens, to begin to develop a concept of themselves as being a part of a global community. And some of the skills that a world citizen might need are the ability to communicate in more than one language. So we need to begin to encourage our young people to become, trilingual, just multilingual in terms of being able to communicate with other parts of the globe. An understanding of the role of science and technology in terms of becoming a world citizen is important in terms of being a part of the next century. Being able to understand the role of culture, for our young people to have a real steady grounding in their own history and culture, but to also be able to relate to other cultures and histories in a way that's productive. Those are some of the kinds of things that, in terms of that new world that we're beginning to fashion, our young people need to have a new set of skills and to begin to talk to them in a way that we can encourage them to move toward the future. They are going to have to be the world citizens. And so, again, those pieces we need to continue to formulate and fashion in terms of projecting them into the future. And the curriculum, the teaching methodologies, all of those kinds of things have to be able to reflect those global connections. Because the equity is not going to necessarily happen at that localized level. Even in the U.S., our young people are going to have to look for those opportunities in other parts of the world.
This particular conference to discuss, and that is the role of these single, all boys schools or all girls schools in public education, and whether or not those need to be. And I lean on the not end. I think that some of the rhetoric that has come from some African American scholars about the teaching of black boys has sent a very negative signal to black girls. When I hear people say things like boys cannot be taught by women, I almost want to respond to those scholars. If women couldn't teach, you wouldn't be here. Or that boys and girls cannot learn in the same classrooms. Given the gaps that we see in our community, at some level, to disenfranchise one part of our population in favor of the other is to say that we're going to have half an army to fight a 2.5 time war. And I know that that is an issue that is volatile and that we're all over the place on it, but I think that this National Conference of Black Studies conference is probably a good place for us to raise it and to have some dialogue on it. And Ruth, I don't know if that was part of what you were raising and asking the question about children, but I think that all too often we have been incredibly alarmist at some of these levels and that we haven't really looked at this in terms of the signals that it sends, for example, to girls.
Yeah, I think in talking about the whole concept of the way we approach things, this is a reaction. We seem to be always reacting and moving from one end to the other. If you are in control, then at certain times or for certain reasons you do certain things, or you mix them in certain proportions. And then when it's not necessary anymore, you move on to other things. There is sometimes the need to set, if women wanted to talk about certain things to do with nurturing and childbirth and so on and so forth, you'll probably be comfortable doing it among women and so on. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with having strong male images being projected without trying to make that some kind of a fetish. And so it is vital for us to take control in order to stop swinging and reacting all over the place.
Just one more. Absolutely. There was a man, I can't see, but I know it is a man.
Just one more comment.
I'm sorry, all the panelists want to get in on this.
Just to dovetail on your concern about the black male academies, I do think it was reactive, because I think what we realized in the African American community that we could no longer entrust the education of our children to those other folks. But again, that may not be the approach, and it may not be one of the signals that we want to send. Instead, realizing that we can no longer depend on these folks to get educated and to become multiculturally literate and sound, we do have to take on initiatives. And those efforts in terms of developing Saturday schools, to begin to teach our own history and culture in our own communities, male and female together, those are the kinds of reactions and proactive efforts that we need to be about in terms of educating our children. And somehow we've moved away from the need to do that. So we need to talk about doing a separatist kind of a thing, but a community as a whole versus separating them out.
We are
during pregnancy. And I believe the effects of the child, which are last and deadly, should be a problem with women should also look at. We know it is a general problem with everybody can talk about smoking giving you problem. But the issue which has been found very serious is that it has great effect on the unborn child and permanently damages various issues. So that smoking, drinking, during pregnancy.
I think that most people heard the question or comment, and I think in terms of just a women's health, the whole issue in the United States anyway, as someone has already suggested, is a tremendous increase in smoking and drinking among women. Now that is, and it's an indication that something else is going on. So that means we've also got to look at the mental health of women and why they are moving in that direction. And obviously the outreach that we have to do is different than the outreach that we would do for other people in terms of trying to make that connection between the woman's health and the health of the baby. And as Jacqueline said earlier, we are being bombarded in the United States, being bombarded in Africa with all of these advertisements about how chic it is to smoke, how chic it is to drink. And so that we've got to approach that problem at all levels. But I know we can't do a trip on women to put so much of the emphasis on the unborn fetus. But we got to talk about the woman in terms of what that is doing to her health, the whole cancer, the whole lung, and all of that other kind of thing. And when we can get that into their psychics, and also that as white America is stopping drinking and smoking, they are importing those products or exporting those products into Africa and into the Caribbean and places like that. And for my sister here, I just wanted to say that one of the reasons that you don't see us at the World Health Organization and some of those other United Nations organizations because they will not let us in. And I know that the International Black Women's Congress has written several proposals to try to do some things collectively with women in Africa, and they've said to us, who has invited you? So the point is, and I think that this is one of the reasons that we're here doing this, is that there are so many of us who have so many different kinds of levels of expertise, is that we can lead with you and lead with different people as we move around this continent, our curriculum vitas, so that when you are indeed looking for somebody, you can ask for us. But believe me, there are significant numbers who would like to do AID and some other kinds of things, even would have non-NGO status at the United Nations. We have tried, and they only let in a select group of organizations, and that's just the way it is. We're not there, not because we don't want to be there, but because this thing is like control. I can remember being at the Women's Conference in '85, and a sense that here are the sisters from the continent, and here are African Americans, and it's like they snatched you away from us, and like you can't talk to them, and the reason that you can't talk to them is because they didn't fund you to be here. And so it's just that whole, again, kind of a divide and conquer that I think us coming here and having this meeting and dialoguing together lets us know why it is that you're here. And sometimes I see you in the United States, and I would like to talk to you, but I can't talk to you because these folks just have brought you over here and snatched you to their house and won't let you come to Newark.
That's right. Yeah. So. Oh, Mary, that's right.
We stated there that we were going to have all sorts of outcomes from that organization. And
very little happens. We have said here that we need some outcomes. I want to follow up on what Francis suggested in terms of the fact that we are not on anyone's agenda, African and African American women. We need to quote each other more, and the best way to do that is through publications. Now, Francis, you suggested, because today, what do we have? We have publishing companies that cater to white males, most of them. Publishing companies that cater to African American males. Publishing companies that cater to feminists, to white women. We have no such organ for African and African American women. Were you serious about trying to launch some sort of effort in terms of marketing women's books? We've got entrepreneurs here, Sister Johnson, Sister Love, Sister Malabo, offices in 3 national and international organizations, the National Black Women's Organization, Black Studies, the International Women's Forum. Would you, any of you, be interested in kicking off a follow-up to these conferences in the form of some sort of publishing venture? Someone has to speak for us.
Well, I must say that in recent years, there is something that is happening between our universities and universities in America, which is really very encouraging, in that we are establishing links with individual universities, and we are now having exchange programs involving both students and faculty. And all I can suggest is that those of you who are faculty in certain universities in the United States can try and find out how you can get funding to establish these links, and then when you have them, you can specify the type of people you want to come over, or in both directions. That maybe you want specifically people who are involved in studies on women and that sort of thing. Then you will get the link. But the problem we have at this end is that it's just not possible to find funding to travel over there. But as the other panelists were saying, that when we get invited over there, maybe somebody else who did the invitation, and so you have a certain commitment to that particular constituency. But if you can arrange for universities to have links with universities here, that at least is one area in which you can get people who are interested in the sort of research work that you probably are interested in.
Over-organized people in the world. We got an association for everything. And I think in terms of the whole matter of global linkages and utilization of resources can come about through our various organizational structures. And I know particularly those of us who have a little more resource than others of us have resources. I know about the issues associated with continental African resources. Continental African universities do not have the sort of funds or access to funds as African American universities do, and those of us that are in them. And I think that there are very creative ways, both within our organizational contexts, whether it's NCBS or AHSA or any of the organizations that purport to be African-centered entities, need to find ways to make these linkages, to provide some resources and so forth. On the other hand, I think that those continental African women who are being courted and used by others for their own resources, because we all know he who pays the piper calls the tune. However, you can sell yourself a little higher than they want you to sell yourselves in terms of stipulating certain things about the nature of your activities when you are being brought to the U.S. by, whether it's by a university or an organization or whatever. And they will assent to that. You don't have to be so grateful to say, isn't it wonderful they're bringing me and therefore I must do everything that they want me to do. But you can stipulate that I must connect with this organization or that organization or what have you. And I've had direct experience with that when African women who are being brought by non-African organizations have said, you must connect with the National Council for Black Studies or the National Association of Black Teachers or whatever. They will do that because it's still very important for them to have the person's presence, and it doesn't cost them much to share it a little bit. So I think that sometimes people from the continent think that it's impolite to make demands or whatever on the host, but I'm here to tell you it is not, and even if it is, don't worry about it, because they get more out of inviting you than you are getting out of going. So I want to just encourage that. And there were about 3 hands over, and we could
understand why you would go to America and relate to the people in your class who are mainly white, and then the black students wouldn't want to deal with you because you speak funny, you speak like you are trying to be white. I mean, I learned English out of a textbook, and that is how I speak English. So you see, there are things which go beyond this particular forum into the question of how we see each other and our presences and absences, not in terms of actuality, but in terms of the way that we have been portrayed to each other. So I think that I would like to make that point very clear. Secondly, that there is a large number of people who are working, especially within policy making, but also in academia, that are very clear on what at least the rhetoric of an African agenda is, and who fight very, very hard to make sure that even if somebody else pays, you do what you want. And I'm in a very good position to say that because that's what I've done for the past 7 years. But also to say that in terms of being creative about publications and so on, it's little things. If you control a journal, you'll make room for articles from people, from the continent. If you have access to a laboratory, you try to make room for 3 months for an African person to come and do their experiments, and then to do a joint thing with them. If you are dealing with certain basic diseases like sickle cell anemia or whatever it is, there is funding for that, and I dare anybody to say that you will be totally excluded because you're African American. I think that we have to overcome some of these things and to look at what is going on the market, even if it is mercenary a little bit, to do that and to try to use the influence that the continental Africans have in terms of access to this funding, and you join them. I mean, that is also a way of getting over these things. The last thing I want to say about publications is the question of distribution. If any linkages are being made in terms of putting out publications, I would like you, in terms of business and so on, to talk about distribution, because this is a very, very serious area. You put out the books, we don't get them. We put out the books, you don't get them. There's something wrong there, and I would like any serious economic discussion to talk about that.
we have to
Question dealt with the physical violence that women face in their own homes, and what can be done about that. For me, I think that the first issue, and we talked just very briefly about this whole concept of support groups, but what we are finding is that there is a growing isolation among women of African ancestry in the United States. I cannot say whether this is happening globally, but in the United States, part of that is a migration pattern of us having left where we grew up, left our parents, and we are away in isolation. Part of it, I think, is what Julianne Melville hit on in terms of our perception of what is the male population and the whole concept of the endangered species, and the whole sense that, a growing sense, I think, as we have bought into somebody else's definition of reality, and the sense that we have to be an appendage to somebody, or we have to have somebody. And so for me, in terms of that whole issue of violence is a re-education of women, and also establishing support systems for women who finding the strength to be able to leave. And the other thing is to be able to discuss this, as you have suggested, that we can have a public discussion about that. Not only the physical violence, but the mental violence against women. And part of it, as she said, the broad shoulder kind of a concept. And all of that is having bought into somebody else's definition of our own reality. That's not how we see ourselves. But if we buy into that, then rather than to have someone to lean on, what I've suggested to women is that my mother was able to do some of the things that she did.